If you've turned on the television, picked up a newspaper, or been online, chances are you have seen someone talking about Ebola and how it has made its way to the United States. It has caused mass panic all over the country, and it seems as though everyone has his or her own opinion of how this disease should be handled. Due to the fact that Ebola has raised such caution in our country, it is important to fully understand this disease and where it comes from. By doing much research, I was able to get a better understanding of Ebola and how it has made its way to the United States. To truly make sense of Ebola, it is important to first look at the history and where it has come from. We will then discuss how it made its way to the United States and if the United States is actually at risk of having an Ebola epidemic. Finally, we will discuss the symptoms and ways to prevent transmitting this disease. We will first get a better understanding of Ebola and where it has come from. To start, we will review the history. The first case of Ebola dates back to 1976, and it has raged on ever since. Ebola started in what is now known as the Republic of Congo near the Ebola River. Since the first Ebola outbreak, there has been 32 outbreaks since. This disease causes serious illness, which is commonly fatal if it is not treated. Ebola was transmitted to people through the blood, organs, and fluids of infected wild animals such as monkeys and gorillas. Ebola spread to the population through human-to-human transmission when one encounters direct contact with someone who has been declared of having Ebola. Also, a person can contract Ebola if they come in contact with surfaces or materials of someone who has had the disease. The outbreak of Ebola that eventually made its way to America started in March 2014 in West Africa. When it first started, this Ebola had only caused 23 deaths. In July of 2014, the first 2 Americans contracted Ebola while they were helping treat patients in Liberia. Both patients were flown to Emory Hospital, and since then they have now been classified as not having Ebola and have been released from the hospital. Although this outbreak started only 8 months ago, it has already infected over 9,000 people and has killed over 4,000. Now that I have discussed the origins of Ebola, we will take a look at how this disease made its way to the United States and how much of a risk the United States is at of having Ebola become a widespread epidemic. The first person to ever be diagnosed with Ebola in the United States was named Thomas Duncan. Duncan contracted Ebola in Liberia while he was visiting his family. He arrived back in the U.S. on September 20th, but he did not show symptoms until September 26th. When he first went to the hospital, Duncan was sent home with antibiotics and Tylenol. 2 days later, he was back in the hospital, and 2 days after that is when doctors got the lab results that Duncan did have Ebola. Unfortunately, Duncan died on October 8th at Texas Presbyterian Health Hospital. After the death of Duncan, 2 nurses have since contracted Ebola from treating Duncan. Luckily, they have both been released from the hospitals and no longer have the virus. So far, Duncan has been the only American to die from Ebola in the United States. A total of 9 Americans have contracted the disease, and 8 have either recovered or are currently recovering. It is also important to note that 7 out of the 9 cases of Americans having Ebola have resulted from them taking care of sick patients who have the disease. Although we could count the number of Ebola cases on 2 hands, it has still caused major panic and widespread chaos through most of the part of the country. According to an article from CNN, over 2/3 of Americans are worried about there being a widespread epidemic of Ebola. Although it is very, very unlikely for this to happen, it is still important for citizens to know the facts and remain calm. Although Ebola is very likely to become a widespread epidemic, it is still very important to be aware of the symptoms and ways to prevent getting the virus. Symptoms of Ebola are very common to those of the flu. The incubation, or time that it takes from when you contracted the disease to when you show symptoms, can be anywhere from 2 to 21 days. Symptoms of Ebola can include headache, fever, stomach fatigue, and a sore throat. According to the World Health Organization, you can prevent the likelihood of getting Ebola by first reducing the risk of wildlife to human transmission. This means making sure that you don't come in contact with animals who are sick with Ebola, and when you are handling animals, make sure you are using gloves and other protective gear. Secondly, you should reduce the risk of human-to-human transmission from contact with people showing symptoms of Ebola. If you are, by chance, taking care of someone who has been said to have Ebola, make sure that you are wearing gloves and protective gear to help protect yourself from getting the disease. Finally, it is recommended that you participate in outbreak containment measures, such as having a good hygiene and keeping a clean environment. Knowing the symptoms and way to prevent Ebola are what can make sure that this does not spread and become an epidemic throughout the country. By knowing the history of Ebola, how it made its way here, along with the symptoms and ways to prevent it, I hope you feel more knowledgeable and at ease about the Ebola virus. I predict that we will be hearing much more about Ebola in the future, especially if there comes to be more cases. However, it's important to remember the facts, and like CNN reporter Mel Robbins says, not to let Ebola turn into Fearbola.